Zethkar had not seen sunlight in 3 cycles. The metal collar around his neck had grown heavier each day. Or perhaps he had simply grown weaker. The auction block beneath his feet was stained with the bodily fluids of countless other slaves who had stood here before him, and he knew his own contribution would soon join theirs. His species, the Veltar, had once been proud warriors. Their homeworld of Kepler 442b had boasted crystal cities that reached toward twin suns, and their people had been known throughout the galaxy for their honor and strength. But that was before the hegemony came, before the plasma bombardments, before the chains. Zethkar's powerful frame, once capable of lifting twice his body weight, now struggled to remain upright. His blue-scaled skin had lost its natural luster, turned dull and gray from malnutrition and despair. The neural inhibitor embedded in his skull kept him docile, unable to access the combat instincts that had made his people so feared. He was no longer a warrior. He was property. The slave market of Terminus Station buzzed with activity. Buyers from dozens of species moved through the crowds, examining merchandise with the same casual interest they might show for livestock. The Vorthan merchants who ran this place made sure their products were well displayed. Bright lights illuminated every scar, every sign of wear or damage that might affect the price. "Next lot!" The auctioneer's voice boomed through the translator units mounted throughout the hall. "Adult male Veltar, approximately 28 standard years. Previous owner reports excellent work capacity in heavy labor and mining operations. Starting bid at 40,000 credits. Zethkar barely listened to the description of his body being sold like a machine. He had heard it all before, 3 times now as he was passed from owner to owner. Each had grown tired of him eventually, or found his skills lacking, or simply decided they needed credits more than they needed a slave. The pattern was always the same. "Do I hear 40,000? The auctioneer's voice carried across the crowd. 40,000! Called a Thragian trader, his insectoid mandibles clicking with satisfaction. 45! Countered a Zephyrian Mining Consortium representative. Zethkar closed his eyes and tried to remember home. The sound of wind through the crystal spires. The taste of water from the pure mountain streams. The faces of his clutch siblings before they had been separated and sold to different corners of the galaxy. Sometimes he wondered if any of them were still alive. 50,000 from the Zephyrian Consortium. Do I hear 55? The bidding continued around him, voices rising and falling like ocean waves. Each number represented years of his life, each increase a heavier chain around his soul. He had stopped hoping for rescue long ago. The Veltar resistance had been crushed completely. There was no one left to save him. 100,000 credits. The voice that spoke those words was different from the others. Quieter, but somehow it cut through all the noise in the auction hall. Zethkar opened his eyes and searched the crowd for the source. 100,000 from the human in Section C, the auctioneer announced, his voice betraying surprise at the sudden jump in price. Do I hear 105? A human. Zethkar had heard of them, but never seen one. They were a new species, recently emerged from their homeworld called Earth. Most of the galaxy considered them an oddity, a primitive race that had somehow stumbled into space travel faster than their social development should have allowed. They were known for being emotional and unpredictable. The bidding hall had gone quiet. 100,000 was far more than a labor slave typically sold for, even a strong Veltar. The other bidders seemed to be reassessing their interest. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. Sold to the human for 100,000 credits. Zethkar found himself looking across the crowd, trying to spot his new owner. Finally, he saw him. The human was smaller than he had expected, about average height for his species, with brown hair and skin that seemed pale compared to most other beings in the hall. He wore simple clothes, not the elaborate robes or uniforms that marked the wealthy traders and consortium representatives. Most surprisingly, when their eyes met across the auction hall, the human did not look at him with the cold evaluation of a buyer examining property. The human looked sad. Processing the sale took 2 standard hours. During this time, Zethkar was returned to the holding pens beneath the auction hall, where hundreds of other slaves waited in cramped conditions for their fates to be decided. The air was thick with the smell of fear and unwashed bodies. Most of the other prisoners were too broken by their circumstances to speak, but a few whispered conversations carried through the darkness. "Did you hear?" asked a Nilarian female in the cage next to his. "The human who bought the Veltar is Captain Marcus Chen of the cargo vessel Endeavor. They say he only has a crew of 12. Humans are supposed to be weak," muttered a Krath warrior who had somehow ended up in chains despite his people's reputation for violence. "Maybe he plans to sell him again quickly." Zethkar said nothing. He had learned long ago that speculation about owners was pointless. They would treat him however they chose to treat him, and his preferences would not factor into their decisions. When the guards finally came for him, they led him through a maze of corridors to a docking bay where a mid-sized cargo ship waited. The vessel was clearly old but well-maintained, its hull scarred by countless journeys between stars, but showing signs of careful repair and upkeep. The name Endeavor was painted in multiple languages along the side. Captain Marcus Chen was waiting at the bottom of the boarding ramp. Up close, Zethkar could see that he was perhaps 35 standard years old, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of someone who worked alongside his crew rather than simply commanding them. When the guards handed over the ownership documents and Zethkar's control codes, the captain accepted them with a nod, but did not immediately activate any of the compliance protocols. "Thank you," the captain said to the guards. "That will be all." After the guards left, the captain stood looking at Zethkar for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the ambient noise of the docking bay and the distant hum of the station's life support systems. "What's your name?" the captain finally asked. The question caught Zethkar off guard. In 3 years of slavery, no owner had ever asked his name. They had given him numbers, designations, sometimes crude nicknames based on his appearance or function, but never once had anyone cared what he called himself. "Zethkar," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Zethkar," the captain repeated, and somehow the way he said it made it sound like a name rather than just a collection of sounds. "I'm Marcus. Come aboard. We have a lot to discuss." The interior of the Endeavor was unlike any slave ship Zethkar had ever seen. The corridors were clean and well lit, with soft lighting that did not hurt his eyes after so long in darkness. The walls were decorated with what appeared to be artwork from various worlds, and plants grew in small alcoves along the passages. It felt like a home rather than a mere vessel. Marcus led him to what appeared to be a common area where several other beings were gathered around a table, sharing a meal. They looked up as the two of them entered, and Zethkar instinctively took a step back, expecting hostility, or at least the cold indifference he had grown accustomed to. Instead, he saw curiosity and what might have been concern. "Everyone, this is Zethkar," Marcus announced. "Zethkar, this is my crew. That's Sandra, my first officer. Jorge is our engineer. Lisa handles navigation. The others are around somewhere." The woman named Sandra, another human with graying hair and intelligent eyes, stood up and extended her hand. Zethkar stared at it, unsure what she expected him to do. "She's offering to shake hands," Marcus explained gently. "It's a human greeting, a sign of respect between equals." Equals. The word hit Zethkar like a physical blow. When had anyone last considered him an equal to anything? Hesitantly, he reached out and touched Sandra's hand with his own. Her skin was warm and her grip was firm, but not aggressive. "Welcome aboard, Zethkar," she said, and her smile seemed genuine. The next few hours passed in a blur of new experiences. Instead of being shown to a holding cell or workstation, Marcus gave him a tour of the ship. The Endeavor was a cargo vessel, but it was clear that the crew took pride in their work and their home. Everything was clean and functional, and the living quarters were comfortable rather than luxurious, but adequate. Finally, Marcus showed him to a small cabin with a single bed, a desk, and a small viewport looking out into space. "This is your room," Marcus said. "You can rest here, keep your personal belongings, whatever you like." Zethkar stared at the bed. It had been 3 years since he had slept on anything softer than bare metal or concrete. 3 years since he had been alone with his thoughts, without the constant noise and movement of other prisoners. "I don't understand," he said finally. "What do you want me to do?" Marcus sat down on the edge of the bed and gestured for Zethkar to take the chair by the desk. "What did you do before you were enslaved?" The question brought memories rushing back. "I was a constructor. We built the crystal towers on my homeworld. After the hegemony came, I worked in the resistance, building fortifications and weapons." His voice grew quieter. "Until they caught me." "Are you good at building things?" "I was. I don't know if I still am." "The neural inhibitor—" Zethkar touched the device embedded in his skull. "It makes it hard to think clearly sometimes." Marcus nodded. "We'll deal with that. But assuming we could remove it safely, would you be interested in helping us with some construction projects? We take on jobs building installations on frontier worlds, space stations, that sort of thing. It's honest work, and we share profits with the whole crew." Zethkar felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. It was a dangerous emotion for a slave, but he could not stop it from growing in his chest. "You would pay me?" "Eventually, yes. First, we need to get that thing out of your head and help you recover your strength. But once you're ready, you'd be a full crew member with an equal share in what we earn." The Veltar warrior, who had once built crystal spires that touched the sky, sat in a small cabin aboard a human cargo ship and wept. For the first time in 3 years, someone had offered him hope instead of chains, respect instead of contempt, a future instead of mere survival. Marcus Chen placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said nothing. Sometimes, the captain had learned, the most important conversations happened in silence. Outside the viewport, the stars wheeled slowly as the Endeavor prepared to depart Terminus Station. Somewhere among those distant points of light was Kepler 442b, where crystal cities lay in ruins and the few surviving Veltar lived as refugees or slaves. But for the first time since his capture, Zethkar allowed himself to believe that he might one day see his home again. Not as a broken slave returning to nothing, but as a free being with the power to rebuild what had been lost. As the ship's engines came online and they pulled away from the station, Zethkar pressed his hand against the viewport and made a silent promise to his lost people. He would heal. He would grow strong again. And somehow, he would find a way to help others who still wore chains. The human had given him more than freedom. He had given him hope. The medical bay of the Endeavor was small but well equipped. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the ship's medic, and the only human Zethkar had met, who was smaller than Captain Chen, examined the neural inhibitor with a frown that seemed to be carved permanently into her features. "This is military grade," she muttered, adjusting her scanner for the 3rd time. "Hegemony design, probably installed by a combat surgeon. It's integrated directly into the pleasure and pain centers of his brain." Zethkar lay on the examination table, trying not to move as the scanner hummed over his skull. After 2 weeks aboard the Endeavor, his body had begun to recover from the worst effects of malnutrition, but the device in his head remained a constant presence, dulling his thoughts and emotions like a gray fog. Marcus stood nearby, his arms crossed and his expression grim. "Can you remove it?" "Maybe," Dr. Tanaka said. But not here, and not with this equipment. We'd need a full surgical facility, probably one with expertise in alien neurology. The wrong move and we could kill him or leave him brain damaged. Zethkar closed his eyes. He had dared to hope, but he should have known better. The hegemony built their slave control devices to be permanent. Freedom was not supposed to be an option. "What about dampening it?" asked Sandra from the doorway. The first officer had become something of a protective presence around Zethkar, always making sure he had enough to eat and that the other crew members understood he was not to be treated as a servant. "Explain," Dr. Tanaka said. Some of the resistance groups during the Earth-Mars conflicts used electromagnetic field generators to interfere with neural implants. Different technology, but the same basic principle. Could we build something to reduce the inhibitor's effectiveness without removing it? The doctor's frown deepened, but this time it was the expression of someone thinking hard rather than someone delivering bad news. "That's actually not impossible. We'd need some specialized components and it would take time to build and calibrate, but yes, we might be able to give you back some of your natural brain function." For the first time in years, Zethkar felt his heart's beating faster with something other than fear. The next month passed like a fever dream of new experiences. While Dr. Tanaka worked on her project, the rest of the crew integrated Zethkar into their daily routines. At first, he had tried to find ways to make himself useful, cleaning corridors or organizing supplies, but Marcus had firmly redirected him. "You're not a servant," the captain had said. "You're recovering from trauma. Take time to heal." It was a concept that Zethkar struggled to understand. In the 3 years since his capture, every moment had been about survival, about enduring the next hour or day. The idea that he could simply exist without constantly proving his worth was foreign and frightening. Jorge, the human engineer, had taken it upon himself to teach Zethkar about the ship's systems. "Your people were builders, right?" he had said. "Want to see how we put this old girl together?" The Endeavor's engineering section was a maze of pipes, conduits, and machinery that somehow worked together to keep them alive in the vacuum of space. Jorge explained each system with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work, and Zethkar found himself drawn into the elegant complexity of it all. "See this?" Jorge pointed to a junction where 3 different power feeds came together. "Standard design would have these running parallel, but that creates inefficiency. I redesigned it to interweave the feeds, reduces power loss by 12%. Zethkar studied the design, his engineer's mind beginning to stir despite the inhibitor's interference. "You could improve it further," he said quietly. "If you ran this conduit through a cooling loop here and added a buffer capacitor there." Jorge's eyes lit up. "Show me." Working with his hands again felt like coming back to life. The tools were different from those he had used on his home world, but the principles of construction and engineering were universal. As his strength returned and his mind began to clear, Zethkar found himself contributing more and more to the ship's maintenance and improvement. The crew treated him with a casual acceptance that bewildered him. Lisa, the navigator, would ask his opinion on route optimizations as if his thoughts mattered. Sandra included him in planning sessions for their cargo runs. Even the other crew members who came and went at various ports seemed to accept him as a natural part of the Endeavor's family. It was during their 3rd week in hyperspace that Zethkar experienced his first real moment of joy since his capture. Dr. Tanaka had finally completed her field generator, a device no larger than a communication badge that she attached to the side of his neck, just below the neural inhibitor. The moment she activated it, the gray fog that had clouded his thoughts for 3 years began to lift. Colors seemed brighter. The constant low-level pain that he had learned to ignore faded away. Most importantly, for the first time since his enslavement, he could think clearly. The full weight of what the humans had given him hit him all at once. Not just freedom from his chains, but kindness without expectation of return, respect for his dignity as a living being, hope for a future that extended beyond mere survival. He had been standing in the common area when the device activated, and the sudden clarity was so overwhelming that he sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. Sandra was beside him in an instant, her hand on his shoulder. "Zethkar, are you all right?" "I can think," he whispered. "I can really think again." The celebration that night was impromptu, but heartfelt. The entire crew gathered in the common area, sharing stories and laughter. Zethkar found himself telling them about his home world, about the crystal cities and the traditions of his people. For the first time in years, he spoke of his past without pain, only nostalgia for beauty that had once existed. "What were the towers like?" asked Lisa, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Imagine growing gemstones tall as mountains," Zethkar said, his newly clear mind providing details he had thought lost forever. "Each one tuned to catch the light of our twin suns. At dawn and dusk, they would sing." "Sing?" Jorge leaned forward, fascinated. "The crystal would vibrate with the temperature changes, creating harmonics. Each tower had its own voice, but together they made music that could be heard across continents." Marcus listened quietly, but Zethkar could see the captain's mind working. "Do you think they could be rebuilt?" The question struck Zethkar like lightning. In all his dreams of returning home, he had only imagined finding whatever remained of his people, not actively rebuilding what was lost. "The knowledge still exists," he said slowly. "The construction techniques were passed down through family lines for generations. Some of us must have survived, and if the hegemony left the planet alone after the conquest." "What would it take?" Sandra asked. "Hypothetically speaking." Zethkar closed his eyes and let his engineer's mind work. "Materials. Most of what we need can be synthesized or mined locally. Equipment for precision crystal growing. A workforce trained in the traditional methods. Time. A lot of time. And funding," Marcus added quietly. The conversation continued late into the ship's night cycle, but Zethkar found himself thinking beyond the immediate discussion. These humans were talking about his impossible dream as if it were simply a difficult engineering project. They spoke of rebuilding an alien world's lost wonders with the same matter-of-fact optimism they brought to every challenge. It was then that he understood something fundamental about humans that the rest of the galaxy had missed. They were not simply emotional or unpredictable. They were hopeful in a way that bordered on insanity, and that hope was contagious. 2 months into his journey aboard the Endeavor, Zethkar faced his first real test. They had docked at Kepler Station for repairs and resupply when the trouble started. The station was a rough place, a trading post on the edge of civilized space where questions were not asked, and documentation was often creative. It was also a place where slavery was not officially legal, but was commonly practiced. Zethkar was helping Jorge load supplies when he heard the voice. "My Lord Kreshatar!" The hegemony overseer's voice carried across the docking bay like a whip crack. "Stop where you are!" Zethkar froze. Kreshatar was the slave designation they had given him, and the neural inhibitor had been programmed to respond to commands delivered in that specific tone and cadence. But the inhibitor was dampened now. Its control reduced to suggestions rather than absolute compulsion. The overseer approached with 2 armed guards, his reptilian features twisted into a satisfied sneer. 3 years of searching, and here you are, loading cargo like a common laborer. Your owner will be pleased to have his property returned." "I have no owner," Zethkar said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The ownership documents say otherwise." The overseer held up a data pad. "You were sold on Terminus Station to a human, but the transaction was never properly registered with hegemony authorities. The sale is therefore void." It was a lie, of course. The hegemony had no authority outside their own territory, and Terminus Station operated under independent laws. But on a place like Kepler Station, legal technicalities mattered less than who had the bigger guns. "Stand down," Jorge said firmly, moving to stand beside Zethkar. The engineer was not a large man, and he was certainly no warrior, but there was steel in his voice. The overseer laughed. "Human, you have no authority here. Stand aside, or we will move you aside." What happened next surprised everyone, especially Zethkar himself. Instead of the fear and paralysis he had felt for 3 years whenever confronted by authority, he felt anger. Clean, pure anger at the injustice of it, at the casual cruelty, at the assumption that his freedom was theirs to take. "No," he said, standing to his full height. Even weakened and still recovering, he towered over the hegemony forces. "You will come with us," the overseer commanded, putting the full weight of his conditioning voice behind the words. "No," Zethkar repeated, and this time he smiled. "I choose my own path now." The confrontation might have escalated to violence, but Captain Chen arrived with Sandra and 3 other crew members. Marcus took in the situation at a glance, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Is there a problem here?" the captain asked mildly. "No problem," the overseer replied, though his confidence had clearly wavered at the sight of armed humans. "Simply reclaiming stolen property." Marcus smiled, but it was not a pleasant expression. "I have full documentation of Zethkar's purchase and his current status as a free crew member. If you have a legal challenge to that, I suggest you take it up with station security." The standoff lasted for several long minutes, but eventually the hegemony forces withdrew. They had no real authority here, and starting a firefight over a single escaped slave was not worth the complications it would create. As they watched the overseers leave, Marcus turned to Zethkar. "You all right?" "Yes," Zethkar said, and realized it was true. For the first time since his capture, he had stood up to his former masters and they had backed down. "I think I am." That night, as the Endeavor prepared to depart Kepler Station, Zethkar stood in his cabin looking out at the stars. His reflection in the viewport showed a being transformed. The dull gray tinge was gone from his scales, replaced by their natural blue luster. His eyes held light again, and his posture spoke of dignity regained, but more than his appearance had changed. The scared, broken slave who had stood on the auction block 6 months ago was gone. In his place was someone he was still getting to know, but who he thought he might actually like. The humans had given him more than freedom. They had given him the chance to remember who he was, and more importantly, to decide who he wanted to become. As the ship pulled away from the station and jumped to hyperspace, Zethkar made a decision. He would stay with the Endeavor and its crew for as long as they would have him. He would learn their ways, understand their inexplicable optimism and hope, and when he was strong enough, when he had earned the right to call himself free, he would find a way to give others what these humans had given him. The crystal towers of his homeworld were gone, but perhaps something even more beautiful could be built in their place. Something that honored the past while reaching toward a better future. Outside his viewport, the stars seemed to beckon with infinite possibility. 2 years had passed since Zethkar first stepped aboard the Endeavor as a broken slave. Now, as he stood on the bridge watching Kepler 442b grow larger in the main viewport, he could barely recognize the being he had once been. The neural inhibitor was gone, finally removed 6 months ago at a medical facility on New Geneva. Dr. Tanaka had stood beside the alien surgeon throughout the delicate procedure, her field generator technology proving crucial to the successful operation. When Zethkar had awakened, truly free for the first time in 5 years, his first word had been, "Thank you," spoken in perfect English. "There," he said softly, pointing to a continent on his homeworld's surface. The crystal cities were built there. Captain Chen stood beside him, older now and with more gray in his hair. The past 2 years had been profitable ones for the Endeavor's crew, thanks in large part to Zethkar's innovations in construction techniques and his growing reputation in the engineering community. But Marcus had aged beyond his years, driven by a project that had consumed increasing amounts of his time and resources. "What do the scans show?" Marcus asked. Sandra, now promoted to commander, consulted her displays. "Minimal hegemony presence, a few automated mining operations, but no permanent bases. It looks like they stripped what they could and moved on." "And the people?" Zethkar's enhanced hearing caught transmissions that the ship's computers were still decoding. Veltar voices, speaking in the old language. His heart raced as he listened to fragments of conversation, signs of life among the ruins. "They're there," he said, "scattered, hiding in the mountains and underground caverns, but they're alive." The Endeavor was not alone in orbit. 3 other ships hung in space nearby, each one carrying specialized equipment and personnel. The human construction vessel, New Hope, carried crystal-growing apparatus designed to Zethkar's specifications. The Centauri medical ship Mercy held supplies to treat diseases and malnutrition. Most importantly, the cargo ship Freedom held something that made Zethkar's soul sing with joy. 137 Veltar refugees rescued from slave markets across the galaxy. The Liberation Project had begun almost by accident. During a routine cargo run to the outer colonies, the Endeavor had encountered a slave ship whose engines had failed. While providing assistance, Zethkar had recognized 3 of his own people among the prisoners. The rescue that followed had been swift and decisive, carried out with the kind of precise planning that Marcus and his crew had perfected over years of operations in gray market space. But rescuing 3 had led to rescuing 30, then 50, then more than 100, as word spread through the underground networks that there was a ship crewed by humans who would pay any price to free enslaved Veltar. The credits had come from everywhere. The Endeavor's crew had contributed their savings willingly. Dr. Tanaka had sold her family's medical practice on Earth to fund the project. Jorge had mortgaged his retirement home. But most of the funding had come from an unexpected source. The human government of Earth, when they learned of the project, had declared it a matter of cultural preservation. The Terran Historical Foundation had provided grants. The Earth Council had voted emergency humanitarian funding. Private citizens across human space had donated whatever they could spare. "Why?" Zethkar had asked Marcus one night, as they reviewed the financial reports showing millions of credits flowing in from human donors. "Why do they care about people they've never met?" Marcus had been quiet for a long time before answering. "Because we've learned that the measure of a civilization isn't how it treats its strong members, it's how it treats those who can't protect themselves." Now, orbiting his ruined homeworld with a small fleet of rescue ships, Zethkar finally understood the true scope of what the humans had given him. Not just his individual freedom, but the power to free others. Not just his life back, but the ability to rebuild an entire civilization. The first shuttles launched at dawn, local time. Zethkar rode in the lead craft, his powerful frame now fully restored and enhanced by the best medical care human science could provide. Beside him sat Kalamesh, an elder who had been among the first rescued. She had become the unofficial leader of the refugee population, and her presence would be crucial to gaining the trust of the survivors below. "Remember," she said quietly as they descended through the atmosphere, "many of them have never seen a human before. They may not trust." "Then we will show them," Zethkar replied. As the humans showed us. The landing site was a valley between 2 mountain ranges, where orbital scans had detected the largest concentration of Veltar life signs. As the shuttle touched down, figures began emerging from cave entrances and rocky hiding places. They moved cautiously, clearly ready to flee at the first sign of danger. The shuttle door opened, and Zethkar stepped out into the light of his twin suns for the first time in 5 years. The air smelled of home, carried scents he had thought lost forever. But it also carried the acrid tang of burned crystal and the dusty emptiness of abandoned places. "My people," he called out in the old language, his voice carrying across the valley, "I have returned, and I have brought hope." The reunion was everything Zethkar had dreamed of, and more painful than he had imagined. The survivors were fewer than he had hoped, perhaps 3,000 scattered across the planet. Many were sick or injured. Children had been born in hiding who had never seen their ancestral cities. The elderly spoke of the crystal towers as myths, stories told to preserve memory in the face of loss. But they were alive. They had endured. The first month was devoted to basic necessities. Medical teams from the Mercy treated diseases that had flourished in the underground refugees. Engineering teams surveyed the ruins and began planning reconstruction. Most importantly, the rescued Veltar from across the galaxy shared their skills and knowledge, teachings that had been preserved in slavery but lost on the homeworld. It was during this period that Zethkar met Zarathul. She was young, born after the conquest, and raised in the caves. Her scales were pale from lack of sunlight, and her eyes held the wariness of someone who had never known safety. But when she saw the crystal-growing apparatus being unloaded from the human ships, her expression changed to wonder. "Is it true?" she asked quietly. "Can the towers really sing?" Zethkar knelt beside her, holding up a small sample crystal that hummed with harmonic resonance. "Would you like to learn how to grow them?" What followed was the most rewarding work of Zethkar's life, teaching the young Veltar the techniques their ancestors had perfected, showing them how science and art could combine to create beauty that lasted for centuries. Many of the refugee elders joined in the instruction, their knowledge combining with his practical experience to recreate the lost arts. The humans worked alongside them, never trying to lead but always ready to help. Marcus and his crew had become something unprecedented in galactic society, a group of beings who liberated others with no expectation of reward or control. Jorge taught Veltar engineers about modern construction techniques. Dr. Tanaka trained local medics in treating diseases that had never existed before the conquest. Sandra organized supply lines and logistics with the efficiency of someone born to command. But it was the small gestures that meant the most. Lisa learning to speak basic Veltar so she could communicate with the children. The human volunteers who spent their off hours playing games with orphaned youngsters. Marcus himself, working 16-hour days to ensure that every detail of the reconstruction was planned correctly. 6 months into the project, the first new crystal tower began to grow. It started as a seed, a precisely grown core of synthetic crystal embedded in the foundations where the greatest of the ancient spires had once stood. Layer by layer, guided by techniques perfected over generations and enhanced by modern technology, it climbed toward the sky. Zethkar stood with Zarathul on the observation platform, watching the tower's progress. In the distance, construction sites for dozens of other towers dotted the landscape. The refugees had been joined by volunteers from across the galaxy, beings who had heard of the reconstruction project and come to help. "The hegemony fears this," Zarathul said quietly. "My mother heard transmissions. They call it dangerous precedent." "Let them fear," Zethkar replied. "Fear is what drove them to destroy in the first place." "We choose to build." The tower's growth accelerated as they watched, the crystal matrix expanding with mathematical precision. But more than the physical structure, something else was growing. Hope, community. the sense that the future could be better than the past. When the first tower reached half its eventual height, it began to sing. The note was soft at first, barely audible above the wind. But as the crystal continued to grow, the harmonic deepened and strengthened. Soon it was joined by others as nearby towers reached resonant frequencies. The sound drew Veltar from across the continent. Refugees who had hidden in caves for years emerged to hear the music of their ancestors. Some wept, others danced. All of them felt something they had not experienced since the conquest: pride in being Veltar. That night, the human volunteers gathered in the common area they had built near the construction sites. It had been Sandra's idea to create a space where all the different species working on the project could come together. The room buzzed with conversation in a dozen languages as engineers, medics, construction workers, and administrators shared the day's accomplishments. Marcus found Zethkar standing apart from the crowd, looking out through the large window at the growing towers. "Regrets?" the captain asked quietly. "About leaving the endeavor?" Zethkar shook his head. "No. You gave me everything I needed to be here. But I will miss the crew." "We're not going anywhere," Marcus smiled. "The Endeavor's new mission is to support this project. We've got supply runs to make, more refugees to rescue, and apparently a second construction site starting on the northern continent." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the crystal towers grow against the starfield. The music had grown stronger throughout the day, and now it seemed to fill the very air around them. "I've been thinking about what you said," Zethkar continued, "about the measure of a civilization." "Oh?" "The hegemony measures itself by what it conquers. The Veltar once measured ourselves by what we built. But you humans, you measure yourselves by what you can help others become." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe that's why we work well together." 1 year later, Zethkar stood at the top of the tallest crystal tower, a structure that now reached nearly a kilometer into the sky. The view encompassed the entire central continent, where dozens of spires created a symphony of harmonic vibration that could be heard from orbit. But the real measure of their success was not the towers themselves. It was the Veltar children who played in their shadows, learning the old songs and creating new ones. It was the families reunited after years of separation. It was the knowledge preserved and enhanced and passed to the next generation. The hegemony had made several attempts to interfere with the reconstruction project, sending warships to intimidate the builders and diplomatic protests to human space, but each time they had been met with the quiet determination that Zethkar had learned to recognize as uniquely human. Earth's government had made it clear that they considered the Veltar homeworld under their protection. More importantly, word of the reconstruction had spread throughout the galaxy, inspiring other liberation projects on other worlds. The age of unchallenged slavery was ending, one rescue at a time. Zarathul joined him on the tower's peak, her scales now bright with health and her eyes shining with purpose. She had become his apprentice in both engineering and leadership and would soon take over the Northern Continent project. "The Endeavor is requesting permission to land," she reported. "Captain Chen says they have 63 new refugees and enough construction materials for 5 more towers." Zethkar smiled, feeling the same joy he had experienced on that first day aboard the human ship. "Permission granted, and send a message to the kitchens. Tell them to prepare a feast. We have family coming home." As the familiar shape of the Endeavor descended toward the landing pad, Zethkar reflected on the strange path that had brought him to this moment. 3 years ago, he had been a broken slave, chained and forgotten on an auction block. He had thought his story was ending. Instead, it had been beginning. The humans had given him freedom, but that was only the start. They had given him purpose, the power to heal others as he had been healed. They had given him hope, the belief that the darkest circumstances could be overcome. Most importantly, they had given him the understanding that true strength came not from what you could take or destroy, but from what you could build and protect. The crystal towers sang in the wind, their music carrying across continents and up to the stars. Somewhere out there, other worlds were listening. Other enslaved peoples were dreaming of freedom. Other builders were preparing to create beauty from ashes. The human ship touched down gently, its cargo bay doors opening to reveal figures stumbling into the light of their home suns for the first time in years. Zethkar made his way down from the tower to meet them, to offer them what had once been offered to him. Welcome, safety, hope. A chance to remember who they were and become who they chose to be. In the distance, the crystal towers continued their eternal song, a melody of resilience and rebirth that would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. And at their base, humans and Veltar worked side by side, building something that neither could have achieved alone, a future worth singing about.